14 years old. That's how old he was when he walked into that courtroom wearing a smirk that would haunt everyone in that room for years to come. He sat there, shackled at the wrist, and laughed. While the prosecutor read the words murder and pregnant, he leaned back in his chair like he was watching a comedy. His mother would never see her daughter born. Her unborn baby would never take a breath. And he knew something the judge didn't know yet, or at least he thought he did. He believed his age would protect him, that the law would see a child instead of what he truly was. But there was a voice coming that day. Not the judges, not the prosecutors. A voice that would strip away every excuse, every lie, every last thread of arrogance he clung to. Stories like this remind us that justice doesn't always move quickly, but it always arrives. If you believe in accountability, in a system that protects the innocent and holds the guilty responsible, hit subscribe now. And below, tell us what you think. Would you believe him if you didn't see the evidence? This is how it all began. Her name was Sarah. She was 38 years old, and she was 7 months pregnant. The nursery in her house was half finished, pale yellow walls, a crib still in pieces on the floor, folded baby clothes stacked neatly in a plastic bin. She'd been rebuilding her life, piece by piece, after years of difficulty. And for the first time in a long time, she was happy. She had her son. She had her new baby on the way. She had a small house in a quiet neighborhood where nothing bad was supposed to happen, where people knew each other's names and looked out for one another. The porch light was always on, the doors locked at night. Everything was normal, everything was safe, or at least that's what she believed. That 14-year-old boy with the smirk had been in that house on the night of November 12th. The police knew it. The prosecutor knew it. The gallery watching from the wooden benches knew it. But he didn't seem to understand yet that knowing and proving were no longer the same thing. His name was Marcus Webb, and he sat at the defense table wearing an Orange County detention jumpsuit, his wrists cuffed to a steel chain around his waist. He was small for his age, just under 5 feet, with the shoulders of a child and hands that looked too young to hold the weight of what they'd done. But his eyes were different. His eyes belonged to someone else entirely. When the judge entered the courtroom on that gray morning in January, everyone stood. Everyone except Marcus, who shifted lazily in his seat and whispered something to his public defender that made his lips curl into that smile. That terrible, empty smile. The prosecutor began to speak. Her voice was steady, measured, professional. She had done this before. She had stood in front of judges and juries and told them about violence and loss, and she had learned to control her breathing, to keep her emotion locked behind a wall of facts. "Your Honor," she said, "on the night of November 12th, the defendant unlawfully and willfully took the life of his mother, Sarah Margaret Webb, age 38. At the time of her death, the victim was 7 months pregnant with her second child. The defendant's actions resulted in not one death, but 2. Marcus's smile didn't waver. He didn't blink. He didn't shift his gaze to the gallery where his mother's sister sat rigid in the 3rd row, her hands trembling in her lap. The prosecutor continued, laying out the charges. First-degree murder, attempted murder of an unborn child, destruction of evidence, obstruction of justice. Words that should have meant something to a 14-year-old. Words that should have landed like stones in a still pond. Instead, he yawned. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the evidence was already in the courtroom. It was in the files stacked in front of the prosecution, in the testimony waiting to be given, in the digital footprints he thought he'd erased but couldn't have. There was a phone with a deleted text message that forensics had recovered from a cloud backup. The message had been sent at 6:47 p.m. on November 12th, just 2 hours before Sarah Webb's neighbors heard nothing at all. The message was simple. 4 words. "It'll be quiet tonight." Marcus had deleted it from his phone almost immediately. He'd thought that meant it was gone. He'd thought deletion meant erasure. He'd thought he understood how technology worked well enough to cover his tracks. But technology remembers everything, and forensic specialists are trained to listen to what machines have to say. The prosecutor knew about the message, the judge would know about the message, and by the time the trial ended, everyone in that courtroom would know that Marcus Webb had planned this moment. The judge was watching him carefully. She was a woman named Patricia Chen, 56 years old, with 28 years on the bench and a reputation for severity that made defense attorneys nervous. She had sentenced murderers, embezzlers, and violent offenders, and she had learned to read faces the way a sailor reads the ocean. She understood what arrogance looked like. She understood what denial looked like. She understood what a child looked like when he had done something unspeakable and couldn't yet accept that the world would not bend to protect him. Judge Chen wrote something on her legal pad, and Marcus didn't seem to notice that the pen moved not in agreement, but in judgment. He was too busy smiling at his lawyer, too busy making a gesture with his cuffed hands that suggested nothing here could touch him. He was too young to understand that the most dangerous thing in that courtroom wasn't the prosecutor, or the evidence, or even the judge. The most dangerous thing was the absolute certainty in his own mind that he could not be caught, could not be convicted, could not be sentenced to anything that would truly hurt. But the prosecutor was about to begin her case, and with it the slow, methodical destruction of every belief Marcus Webb held about his own invulnerability. She stood, gathered her files, and approached the jury box. 12 people who had taken an oath to listen, to weigh the evidence, to determine the truth beyond a reasonable doubt. 12 people who would see the photographs, hear the testimony, and watch Marcus Webb's face change from arrogance to something else entirely. She looked directly at the jury, then back at the defendant. "Let me tell you," she said, "about the night a child became a killer. Let me tell you about the evidence. Let me tell you about a young man who believed the law did not apply to him, that age was armor, that a smile could erase the truth. Let me tell you what the evidence actually says." Marcus was still smiling, but something in his posture had shifted. Something had changed. For the first time since walking into that courtroom, he was no longer entirely certain that he was invincible. The judge tapped her pen against the bench once, deliberately. The sound echoed through the silence like a warning bell. Sarah Margaret Webb was 38 years old, and she had learned how to rebuild herself quietly. There was no drama in her life anymore, no grand gestures or desperate moments. She worked as an administrative assistant at a dental office downtown, arriving at 7 in the morning and leaving at 5, always professional, always reliable. Her coworkers described her as kind, not overly friendly, but kind in the way that mattered. She remembered birthdays, she covered shifts when people needed help. She smiled at patients who were nervous about their procedures. She lived in a neighborhood called Oakwood Heights, on a street where houses sat back from the road and lawns were maintained with the kind of care that suggested people took pride in what was theirs. The houses were modest but well kept, with wraparound porches and trees that had been there for decades. It was the kind of neighborhood where doors were locked at night, but not because anyone was afraid. Doors were locked because that's what you did. That's what normal people did. That's what safe people did. She had purchased her house 5 years earlier, and the first thing she had done was paint the master bedroom a soft gray and hang new curtains. The second thing she had done was look at the second bedroom, the one that would become the nursery, and imagine what it might look like one day, filled with a baby's things. For years, that room had remained empty. She had focused on her career, on stabilizing her finances, on building a life that was quiet and secure. And then, unexpectedly, she had met someone. The relationship hadn't lasted long, but it had given her something she thought she had lost: hope. When she discovered she was pregnant at 37, carrying a daughter, she had sat alone in her house for 3 hours and cried. But they were not sad tears. They were the tears of someone who believed finally that her life would have the shape she had always wanted it to have. The nursery had become her project. On weekends, she had painted the walls a pale yellow, a color that felt both cheerful and calming. She had purchased a crib, though it remained mostly unassembled, the pieces stacked carefully in a corner. She had bought sheets with tiny stars and blankets and a mobile shaped like clouds. She had folded everything carefully and placed it in a plastic storage bin with a label that read, "Baby girl, due March 15th." She had even chosen a name, Eleanor. She had written it in her journal, sketched it in the margin of her calendar, whispered it to herself at night. Eleanor would be born in March. Eleanor would sleep in that crib. Eleanor would grow up in this house with a mother who loved her and a brother who would eventually understand that being a big brother was a privilege, not a burden. But Marcus had not understood that. Marcus was 14 years old, and he had become increasingly difficult in the past 18 months. Before that, he had been a normal boy, moody at times, as teenagers were, but essentially good. He had played football in middle school, had friends over on weekends, had seemed like he was developing into a decent young man. Then something had shifted. At 13, he had begun withdrawing. He had stopped playing football. He had spent more time in his room. His grades, which had been average, had become erratic. Some teachers reported that he was disruptive in class, making jokes at inappropriate times, challenging authority, seeming to find amusement in other people's discomfort. Sarah had taken him to a therapist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Morrison, who specialized in adolescent behavior. For 6 weeks, Marcus had attended appointments. He had sat in her office and presumably discussed whatever it was that was bothering him. But after 6 sessions, Sarah had received a phone call. Marcus, Dr. Morrison explained, seemed reluctant to continue. He said there was nothing wrong with him. He said the sessions were pointless. Dr. Morrison had suggested that perhaps Marcus needed more time to develop trust. But Sarah was tired. She was tired of fighting with her son, tired of paying for therapy that he clearly didn't want. She had decided to let it go. That decision would haunt her sister for the rest of her life. Because what Sarah had missed, what she had dismissed as typical teenage attitude, were the warning signs that everyone later insisted should have been obvious. Online searches recovered from Marcus's browser history revealed a concerning pattern. Late at night, he had looked up things like how to disable alarms and untraceable ways and what happens if. He had deleted the searches, but they were still there, embedded in the digital memory of his computer. He had written in his journal, a leather notebook that would later become evidence, things that chilled everyone who read them. "Nobody respects me," he had written. "They all think they're better than me. But they'll see. They'll all see that I'm in control." His mother had found the journal once, hidden under his mattress, and had read those lines. She had asked him about them. He had shrugged and said it was just teenage stuff, just venting. She had believed him. The pregnancy had changed the dynamic in their house. Sarah had become increasingly focused on preparing for Eleanor's arrival. She had bought books about parenting, had attended prenatal classes, had spent her evenings doing online research about cribs and car seats and the best way to swaddle a newborn. She had talked to Marcus about being a big brother, trying to include him in her excitement. But Marcus had responded with indifference, then with irritation, then with something darker, a kind of resentment that seemed to grow with each passing week. He had begun making comments. "Another person to take attention away from me," he had said once. "Another mouth to feed." Sarah had attributed it to jealousy, the normal response of a teenager facing a major change in his family structure. She had told him that her love for him wouldn't change, that there was enough love for both him and Eleanor. But there was something in the way he looked at her when she said it, a cold, assessing look that she couldn't quite place. On the evening of November 12th, Sarah had sent a text message to her best friend, Linda. The message was simple and ordinary. "Thinking dinner at Marco's tomorrow? I'm craving pasta, and I need to get out of the house. Let me know. That text, sent at 5:43 p.m., would be the last thing Sarah Webb ever wrote. 2 hours later, the porch light was still on, waiting for someone who would never come home. When the police searched Marcus Webb's school records after his arrest, they found something that haunted the principal for years afterward. It was a pattern. Not obvious at first, but there when you looked for it. In 6th grade, a teacher had noted that Marcus had a talent for manipulation. He could convince other students to do things for him, to take blame for his actions, to isolate classmates he didn't like. The teacher had written it up as a behavioral concern, but nothing had been done. Marcus was intelligent, his grades were decent, and the behavior, while concerning, wasn't violent. In 7th grade, another incident. A group of students had reported that Marcus had told them a lie so elaborate, so carefully constructed, that they had believed it completely. He had made up a story about one of his classmates being a criminal, had spread the rumor with precision, and the rumor had followed that student for an entire semester. When confronted, Marcus had denied everything. When shown the evidence of his involvement, he had blamed others, had twisted the narrative, had walked away from the situation, having learned nothing except how easily people could be deceived. The concerning part, according to the school psychologist who reviewed the file after the fact, was that Marcus showed no remorse. When students were typically caught in lies or acts of manipulation, they experienced shame. They cried. They apologized. They learned. Marcus did none of these things. He acknowledged the facts only when he was presented with irrefutable proof, and even then his acknowledgment came with no emotional content. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "I feel terrible." He said, "Okay, whatever," and moved on. The school had conducted an assessment in 7th grade. The psychologist had administered tests. She had written a report recommending that Marcus receive counseling, that his parents be informed of his behavioral patterns, that the school monitor his social interactions carefully. The report had been filed in his record. Sarah had received a copy. She had read it, had acknowledged it, and had filed it away. There had been no follow-up, no intervention, no real attempt to understand what was happening inside her son's mind. By 8th grade, the warning signs had multiplied. Teachers reported that Marcus showed no empathy toward other students. When a girl in his math class had broken her leg and struggled to get to class, Marcus had made jokes about her injury. When another student had been rejected publicly by a friend group, Marcus had found the situation entertaining. He had laughed openly, had mimicked the rejected student's pain, had seemed to derive genuine pleasure from someone else's suffering. These incidents, taken individually, might have been chalked up to typical teenage cruelty. But taken together, they formed a picture that was deeply concerning. A child who lied without hesitation. A child who manipulated without remorse. A child who found joy in others' pain. A child who showed no emotional response to anything that didn't directly benefit him. The school had documented it all, had sent copies home, had suggested, gently, carefully, that Marcus might benefit from outside counseling. That was when Sarah had taken him to Dr. Patricia Morrison. She had hoped that a professional could help her understand what was happening with her son, could give her strategies to manage his behavior, could perhaps identify some underlying issue, anxiety, depression, attention deficit, that could be addressed with medication or therapy. But Marcus had refused to engage. He had sat in Dr. Morrison's office and given one-word answers. He had been dismissive and evasive. He had made it clear that he believed he was being punished for being himself, that his mother was conspiring against him, that there was nothing wrong with him at all. After 6 sessions, he had told his mother he wasn't going back. Sarah, exhausted and frustrated, had allowed him to stop. Dr. Morrison had written a letter suggesting more intensive intervention, perhaps inpatient evaluation. But Sarah had put the letter in a drawer and never responded. The online searches that would later become crucial evidence in the prosecution's case had begun in earnest during the month of October, just 6 weeks before the murder. Someone in that house had spent multiple evenings looking up specific information. How to disable home security systems, how to commit crimes without leaving evidence, what fingerprints could tell investigators, how long it took for bodies to decompose, whether people could kill someone without experiencing remorse afterward. The searches weren't disguised. They weren't hidden behind proxy servers or encrypted browsers. They were simply searched and deleted as though Marcus believed that deletion meant oblivion. The police found them in the browser cache, in the ISP records, in the cloud data that tech companies retained for years. The timestamp showed that the searches had occurred late at night, often between midnight and 3 in the morning, when Marcus was supposed to be sleeping. His mother was asleep upstairs, the house was quiet, and Marcus was teaching himself how to commit the perfect crime. The arguments between Sarah and her son had intensified as her pregnancy progressed. She had set boundaries. Marcus was not allowed to speak to her disrespectfully. He was not allowed to refuse his responsibilities around the house. He was not allowed to stay up all night on his computer. When she attempted to enforce these boundaries, Marcus had responded with fury. He had called her names. He had told her that she was destroying his life, that the baby was a selfish decision, that he wished he had never been born into this family. Sarah had cried. She had called her sister and vented her frustration, asking for advice on how to parent a teenager who seemed determined to be difficult. Her sister had suggested that Marcus was jealous, that he was struggling with the transition, that everything would be better once the baby was born and he adjusted to his new role. Everyone believed that time would heal this particular wound. Everyone believed that Marcus was going through a phase. But Marcus had believed something entirely different. He had made a decision somewhere in the dark hours of those October nights, scrolling through information about murder and forensics and the way the world forgot about people once they were gone. He had decided that his mother represented everything wrong with his life. Her boundaries, her rules, her focus on the baby, her refusal to acknowledge that he was superior, that he deserved special treatment, that the normal rules of society did not apply to him. He had decided that she needed to be removed. And more than that, he had decided that he would remove her in a way that would demonstrate his intelligence, his planning, his absolute control over his own future. He had already written the ending to this story. All that remained was the writing. The police reconstruction of what happened on the evening of November 12th came together piece by piece, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. The first piece was timing. Sarah Webb had been alive at 5:43 p.m. when she sent her text message to her friend Linda about dinner plans. She had been alive and thinking about pasta and conversation and the simple pleasure of getting out of the house for an evening. By 8:15 p.m., when her sister called to ask if she wanted to join her for a late movie, Sarah Webb was already dead. The window between those two moments, 2 hours and 32 minutes, contained everything. The house itself became evidence. The investigators had walked through it in those early morning hours after the body was discovered, documenting every room, every hallway, every closed door. The layout was simple. A living room at the front, a kitchen adjacent, a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. Sarah's bedroom was on the left side of the hallway, doors closed. Marcus's bedroom was on the right. The baby's room, Eleanor's room, still unfinished, was at the end of the hall. The physical space told a story about who had been where, about the distances involved, about the time it would have taken to move between rooms. The sequence of events, as reconstructed by forensic specialists, began when Marcus left his room. The evidence suggested that he had planned this moment. His timing was deliberate. Sarah had been alone in her bedroom, preparing for the evening. She had changed into comfortable clothes, had perhaps been reading or resting, as pregnant women do in the late afternoon when fatigue sets in. Marcus had walked down that narrow hallway with purpose. He had not hesitated. He had not second-guessed himself. Later, when investigators asked him directly about his state of mind in those moments, he had simply shrugged. He had said nothing about panic, nothing about doubt, nothing about the voice inside that might have told him to stop. The absence of those things was perhaps the most chilling part of the entire narrative. A normal 14-year-old, confronted with the reality of what he was about to do, would have felt something. Fear, hesitation, revulsion. Marcus felt none of these things. He had walked into his mother's bedroom as though he were simply walking to the kitchen for a glass of water. What happened next was swift and controlled. The medical examiner's report, which would be read aloud in the courtroom weeks later, described injuries consistent with blunt force trauma sustained from a heavy object. The attack had been sudden. There had been no signs of struggle, no defensive injuries on Sarah's hands or arms that would suggest she had tried to fight back, to protect herself. The speed and control suggested someone who had planned this moment, who understood what he was about to do, who had rehearsed it in his mind so many times that when the moment came, his body simply followed the script he had written. The pregnancy, 7 months along, complicated the medical picture in ways that the prosecutor would later present to the jury with careful precision. Sarah Webb had not been alone in that room. Eleanor, the baby girl who would never be born, had been present as well. The prosecutor had looked directly at Marcus when she stated this fact. 2 human beings were killed that night, your mother and your sister. Marcus had stared at the table. After it was finished, after the moments of violence had ended and the silence had returned to that house, Marcus had done something remarkable in its ordinariness. He had washed his hands. The forensic evidence showed traces of blood on the bathroom sink, places he had cleaned carefully, but not perfectly. The police later found a single hair, his, caught in the drain where he had attempted to rinse away the physical evidence of what he had done. He had changed his clothes. The shirt and pants he had been wearing were found later, hidden in a sports bag at the back of his closet, covered by other clothes, but accessible if anyone had thought to look. There was blood on them, blood that matched Sarah Webb's DNA, blood that would eventually be used to place Marcus at the scene of the crime with absolute certainty. He had not panicked during any of this. He had not called for help. He had not called 911. He had not expressed horror or remorse or anything approaching normal human emotion in response to what he had just done. Instead, Marcus had done something else. He had called the police himself, but not immediately. He had waited. He had spent time. According to the reconstruction, he had spent approximately 20 minutes alone in that house after his mother's death. What did a 14-year-old boy do in those 20 minutes? The police had asked him. He had refused to answer, but the evidence suggested something cold and calculated. He had perhaps cleaned. He had perhaps thought through his story, the narrative he would present to the authorities, the explanation that would allow him to escape accountability. He had perhaps felt the weight of what he had done beginning to settle on him, and found that he could carry it. He had perhaps felt nothing at all. When he finally dialed 911, his voice on the recording was steady. He had reported that he had come home and found his mother unresponsive. He had said he didn't know what had happened. He had said he was scared. To anyone listening to that recording without the context of the evidence, he might have sounded like a frightened teenager who had witnessed something terrible. But the investigators who listened to it after they understood the facts heard something different. They heard calculation. They heard performance. They heard a child who had committed something monstrous and was now engaged in the work of lying about it. The house had gone silent after the police arrived, after the paramedics made their futile attempts to resuscitate a woman who had been beyond resuscitation for more than an hour. After the body had been removed and the scene had been photographed and documented and sealed. The refrigerator continued to hum, as refrigerators do. The lights remained on in the hallway. The porch light stayed illuminated, still waiting for a woman who would never come home. The crib in Eleanor's room remained unassembled, the mattress still wrapped in plastic, the sheets still folded in their plastic bin. and Marcus Webb sat in the back of a police car, having just begun to understand, perhaps, that he had miscalculated something, that the world, contrary to everything he believed about himself, had ways of holding children accountable that his mind had not fully considered. The 911 recording would later be played in the courtroom, and every person who heard it would understand, in some deep and intuitive way, that something was wrong. The call had come in at 8:17 p.m. on November 12th. A dispatcher had answered, her voice professional and calm, trained through years of practice to remain steady regardless of the chaos on the other end of the line. But the voice on the other end of the line was also calm. It was the voice of a 14-year-old boy named Marcus Webb, and he was reporting that his mother was unresponsive. He had come home from school, he explained. He had found her in her bedroom. He didn't know what had happened. He was scared. But the prosecutors, listening to that recording in preparation for trial, noticed something that most people would miss. The fear didn't sound real. The tone was flat, almost rehearsed. There were no sounds of panic in the background. There were no hyperventilating breaths, no trembling voice, no emotion breaking through the words. A 14-year-old boy who had just discovered his mother dead should have sounded terrified. This boy sounded like he was reading from a script. The first responders arrived at the house within 8 minutes. 2 police officers and an ambulance with paramedics. They found Marcus sitting on the front porch, his posture upright, his expression controlled. When they asked him what had happened, he repeated his story. He had come home, found his mother, didn't know what happened, was scared. The paramedics rushed into the house, moving with the practiced urgency of people trained to save lives. But when they reached the bedroom, they understood immediately that there was nothing to save. Sarah Webb had been dead for at least an hour, possibly longer. The body temperature, the lack of responsiveness to stimuli, the dependent lividity beginning to form in the extremities, all of it told a story of death that had occurred well before the 911 call. While the paramedics were documenting their observations, the police officers were documenting theirs. They walked through the house, noting the scene, taking in details that would later become crucial evidence. The first thing they noticed was that there was no sign of forced entry. The front door was locked. The back door was locked. The windows were closed and undamaged. The house did not look like a place where a stranger had forced their way inside. It did not look like a place where an intruder had committed a violent crime. It looked like a place where something had happened from within. The living room was orderly. The kitchen was clean. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken dishes, nothing to suggest that a violent altercation had occurred. The scene was almost too neat, as though someone had been careful to disturb as little as possible, as though someone had planned not just the crime itself, but the way the scene would appear to the investigators who would later examine it. The lead officer, a man named Detective Raymond Harris with 22 years of experience, began to notice other things. Marcus's story was that he had come home after school and found his mother unresponsive, but the house did not look like the house of someone who had experienced shock. There were no dropped belongings, no scattered contents from a hastily abandoned backpack, no evidence of the kind of chaos that accompanies sudden discovery. The blood pattern analysis, conducted by a forensic specialist who arrived later that evening, would prove to be perhaps the most damning piece of evidence in the investigation. The specialist photographed the scene carefully, documenting the location of blood spatter, the direction of the patterns, the areas where blood was concentrated, and the areas where it trailed off. Blood tells a story. It adheres to the laws of physics. It moves in predictable ways depending on force, direction, and speed. The blood evidence in Sarah Webb's bedroom told a story that contradicted Marcus's account. The patterns suggested that the violence had been sustained and controlled, that whoever had inflicted the injuries had stood in a specific location and had struck repeatedly. The patterns did not suggest a struggle. They did not suggest self-defense or resistance. They suggested one person attacking another person who had not fought back effectively. The location of the blood spatter on the walls and ceiling indicated the height and position of whoever had been wielding the weapon. The specialist, comparing the blood pattern evidence with Marcus's height, concluded that the pattern was entirely consistent with a person of Marcus's stature inflicting the injuries. The neighbors had heard nothing. This was perhaps the most striking part of the investigation. The houses on Oakwood Heights were not far apart, but they were far enough that normal household sounds didn't carry easily between them. Still, a violent attack should have produced some noise, a struggle, cries for help, the impact of heavy blows. The officers asked the neighbors on either side of the Webb house if they had heard anything unusual that evening. Both neighbors reported that they had heard nothing. No screams, no sounds of violence, no indication that anything was wrong. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Dorothy Chen, mentioned that she had seen Marcus coming and going that afternoon, but nothing had seemed out of the ordinary. Detective Harris noted that this absence of sound was significant. It suggested either that the attack had been very brief or that there had been very little resistance, or both. It suggested a 14-year-old who had done this before, in his mind, so many times that his body simply knew what to do. As the evening wore on, the officers observing Marcus began to notice his demeanor. He was not crying. He was not expressing anger or shock or any of the emotional responses that would be expected of a 14-year-old whose mother had just been killed. He was cooperative with the police. He answered their questions. He allowed them to take samples, swabs from his hands, fibers from his clothing. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not seem to understand that the police were beginning to suspect him. Or perhaps, Detective Harris later reflected, he understood perfectly. Perhaps he had calculated that his age would protect him, that the system would be reluctant to believe that a child could do something like this. Perhaps he was waiting to see how far his arrogance could take him. Late that evening, as the police were preparing to search the house more thoroughly, Marcus mentioned something almost casually. His phone, he said, had gone missing. He thought he had left it somewhere in the house. He wasn't sure where. The police found the phone 18 hours later, hidden in a sports bag in the back of Marcus's closet, covered by other items. When they examined it, they discovered that the browser history had been cleared. They discovered that several text messages had been deleted. And they discovered, with the help of the phone company's cloud backup system, a single message that Marcus had believed he had erased completely. The deleted text message would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. It was simple, just 4 words, but those 4 words contained everything the prosecution needed to prove premeditation. "It'll be quiet tonight." The message had been sent from Marcus's phone at 6:47 p.m. on November 12th, approximately 90 minutes before the 911 call. It had been sent to a phone number belonging to a boy named Tyler Chen, one of Marcus's few remaining friends. Tyler had received the message and had thought nothing of it at the time. It had seemed innocuous, the kind of cryptic statement that teenagers sent to each other without much thought. But when the police asked Tyler what Marcus meant, Tyler's face had gone pale. He had said he thought Marcus was talking about a video game, a game where things got quiet before something happened, a game where you had to be strategic and silent. But both Tyler and the police understood in that moment that Marcus had not been talking about a video game at all. He had been talking about his plan. He had been announcing to at least one person what he intended to do. He had been telling someone that the house would be quiet that night, that something was going to happen in that quiet, and that he was prepared for it. The forensic specialists at the Digital Crime Unit had recovered the message from the cloud backup system within 24 hours. Marcus had deleted it from his phone, but cloud systems are designed to preserve data. They keep copies of everything. They maintain redundancy and backup systems. They remember what people try to forget. The message existed in digital space, tagged with a timestamp, associated with Marcus's phone number, impossible to deny. The prosecution had also recovered Marcus's search history from the previous weeks. The searches had been specific and revealing. How to clean up crime scenes. What evidence do investigators look for? Fingerprint evidence. Can you get away with murder if you're a minor? What is the juvenile court system? At what age can you be tried as an adult? The timeline of the searches showed a pattern of increasing specificity. Early searches had been general, questions about violence and consequences. Later searches had become focused on evidence and the legal system. The most recent searches, conducted just days before the murder, had been about exactly what one needed to do to avoid being caught. Marcus had been studying not just how to commit a crime, but how to avoid the consequences of committing one. The shoe print evidence came next. A forensic specialist had documented shoe prints in blood at the crime scene. The prints had been photographed, measured, and carefully preserved as evidence. When the police obtained Marcus's shoes, they discovered that one of them matched the print found in the blood. The size, the tread pattern, the specific wear marks on the sole, all of it aligned. It was not a perfect match, not in the way that DNA or fingerprints could be perfect, but it was sufficiently distinctive that the specialist could state, with high certainty, that the shoe print in blood had been made by the shoe Marcus had been wearing on the evening of November 12th. The prosecution would later present this evidence with quiet clarity. The defendant's own footprints placed him at the scene of the crime in his mother's blood at the moment of her death. Marcus had left his signature at the crime scene without even realizing it. He had believed himself so intelligent, so careful, but he had forgotten about something as simple as the sole of a shoe. The blood transfer evidence was perhaps the most damning of all. The police had collected Marcus's clothing and sent it for analysis. The shirt he had been wearing when he called 911 contained no blood, or rather, contained no visible blood. But the forensic specialists at the laboratory used alternate light sources, techniques developed over decades of criminal investigation, to reveal what the naked eye could not see. There was blood on that shirt. There was blood on his pants. There was blood on the cuffs of his long-sleeve shirt, in places where he had attempted to wash but had not washed thoroughly enough. Blood that matched Sarah Webb's DNA profile. Blood that could only have come from direct contact with the victim or with surfaces contaminated by the victim's blood. Blood that placed him conclusively and irrefutably at the scene of the crime, committing the act of violence. The timeline, once established clearly, became impossible for the defense to work around. Sarah Webb had sent her text message at 5:43 p.m. Marcus had sent his message, "It'll be quiet tonight," at 6:47 p.m. This placed him at home, aware of his intentions, prepared for what he was about to do. The medical examiner estimated that death had occurred between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m., based on body temperature and the degree of rigor mortis. Marcus had called 911 at 8:17 p.m., claiming to have just discovered his mother dead. The timeline fit perfectly with the theory that Marcus had killed his mother, had spent approximately 20 minutes cleaning up, and had then called the police. His story, that he had been at school and had come home to find his mother dead, was impossible. School had ended at 3:15 p.m. According to the cell phone records, his phone had pinged the tower nearest his home at 3:47 p.m., indicating that he had arrived home before 4 p.m. He had been in the house for hours. He had been in the house when Sarah returned from work. He had been in the house, planning, preparing, waiting for the moment when the house would be quiet and his mother would be alone. The detectives working the case began to understand, with absolute certainty, that they had captured someone guilty. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was direct, multiple, and convergent. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. Every forensic test confirmed the same conclusion. Digital evidence proved premeditation. Physical evidence placed him at the scene. Blood evidence connected him directly to the victim. And perhaps most importantly, his own behavior, his calm demeanor, his lack of emotion, his failure to express any grief or shock, suggested someone who understood on some level that he had been caught. The prosecutor sat in her office the night before the trial began and reviewed the evidence one final time. She looked at the photographs, the test results, the forensic reports. She understood what she was about to present to a jury. She understood that no reasonable doubt existed. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was airtight. They already knew that Marcus Webb was guilty. Now they simply had to prove it to the court. The interrogation room was small, windowless, and cold. It was designed that way intentionally, designed to make suspects uncomfortable, to break down their resistance, to encourage them to confess and escape the discomfort of that space. But Marcus Webb did not seem uncomfortable. He sat across the metal table from Detective Raymond Harris, his hands unshackled because he was 14 and because the police were trying, at that point, to maintain the appearance of treating him as a juvenile rather than a criminal. Marcus sat with his elbows on the table and examined his fingernails with what appeared to be genuine interest. The detective began with the basics. "Marcus, I'm Detective Harris. I want to talk to you about what happened on November 12th. Marcus looked up slowly, as though he had been interrupted while doing something far more important. "I already told you," he said. "I came home and found her." His tone was not defensive. It was not tearful. It was bored, the tone of a teenager who had already explained something obvious and could not understand why it needed to be explained again. The detective had interviewed hundreds of suspects over his career. He understood that shock could manifest as flatness, that trauma could numb emotional response, that a person in crisis might seem distant or disconnected. But he had also learned to recognize the difference between shock and something else entirely. "Walk me through it again," the detective said, keeping his voice neutral and steady. Marcus sighed, as though the request represented an unreasonable burden on his time. He explained his story again. He had come home from school, had gone to his room, had heard nothing unusual, had decided to check on his mother, had found her in her bedroom, had called 911. His account was consistent. It was also, the detective understood, almost entirely fabricated. What was remarkable about Marcus's account was not what he said, but what he didn't say. He didn't express confusion about what had happened. He didn't speculate about whether his mother had had a medical emergency or an accident. He didn't ask questions about her condition, about whether she would recover, about what had caused her death. A normal teenager would have asked those questions. A teenager who had genuinely discovered his mother dead would have been desperate for information, for reassurance, for anything that might make sense of what he had witnessed. Marcus asked nothing. He stated his account and then returned his attention to his fingernails, as though the conversation was finished and he had more important things to do. The detective leaned forward slightly. "Marcus, your mother is dead. Do you understand that?" Marcus looked up, met his eyes for a moment, and then looked away. "Yeah," he said. "I understand." There was no emotion in the word, no grief, no shock, no fear, just acknowledgement of a fact, the way one might acknowledge that it was raining or that the room was cold. The detective tried a different approach. "When was the last time you saw your mother alive?" Marcus thought about this for a moment. "I guess when she got home from work, around 5:30 or 6. "What did you do together?" "Nothing. I went to my room. She went to her room." "Did you talk to her?" "No." "Did you argue with her?" Marcus paused at this question. Something flickered across his face, a brief flash of something that might have been annoyance. "Sometimes we argue," he said. "Did you argue with her on November 12th?" "No." The detective had access to the text message, to the search history, to all the evidence that proved this was a lie. But he was building something here, a record of Marcus's willingness to lie, his comfort with deception, his casual manipulation of the truth. "Are you sure?" Marcus met his eyes again. "Yeah, I'm sure." What the investigators would learn over the following days and weeks was that Marcus possessed a personality profile that was deeply troubling. A forensic psychologist named Dr. Shiru, Kenneth Matthews, was eventually brought in to evaluate him. Dr. Matthews conducted a series of tests, interviews, and assessments designed to understand the architecture of Marcus's mind. The results were disturbing. Marcus scored extremely high on measures of narcissism. He believed himself to be superior to others. He believed that normal social rules did not apply to him. He experienced no genuine empathy. He could mimic empathy when it served his purposes, but he did not feel it. He was also extremely high in callousness and lack of affect. He did not experience emotions in the way that typical people did. Fear, guilt, shame, remorse, these were not part of his psychological landscape. What Marcus experienced was different. He experienced interest in how things worked. He experienced satisfaction when he achieved his goals. He experienced irritation when people interfered with his plans. But he did not experience the emotional consequences of his actions in any meaningful way. The most chilling aspect of Dr. Matthews' evaluation was his conclusion that Marcus showed no signs of remorse for his actions. When confronted with photographs of his mother's body, with descriptions of her injuries, with the reality of what he had done, Marcus did not cry. He did not look away. He showed no physical signs of distress. He simply looked at the photographs and shrugged. "Okay," he said. "So?" The "so" was perhaps the most revealing word he spoke during the entire evaluation. It suggested that, from Marcus's perspective, the death of his mother was simply a fact, neither good nor bad, neither significant nor insignificant. It was simply something that had happened. The fact that it had caused tremendous suffering, that it had taken 2 lives, that it had destroyed his family and traumatized an entire community, none of this registered with Marcus as important. All that mattered to him was that he had carried out his plan successfully. All that mattered was that he had achieved what he had set out to achieve. The interrogation continued for hours. The detective presented evidence slowly, watching for reactions. When confronted with the text message, "It'll be quiet tonight," Marcus simply said that he had been talking about a video game. When confronted with the search history, he said that he searched things all the time, that it meant nothing. When confronted with the blood evidence, he said that he must have touched her after finding her, that he was trying to help. Each lie was delivered with the same flat effect, the same absence of emotional commitment. Marcus was not struggling to construct these lies. They flowed from him easily, naturally, as though lying was simply his default mode of communication, and underlying everything was that smile. It was not a full smile, not a grin. It was more subtle than that, a slight curling at the corners of his mouth, a suggestion of amusement, a hint that he found something about this entire situation entertaining. The detective had seen many hardened criminals in his career, men who had committed terrible things and had learned to hide their emotional responses. But he had never seen anything quite like this. He had never seen a child, because that's what Marcus was, technically a child, who seemed so completely unbothered by the magnitude of what he had done. The courtroom was divided into 2 distinct halves by an invisible line that ran down the middle of the room. On one side sat the family. Sarah Webb's sister, Catherine, sat in the 3rd row with her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Their mother, Sarah's elderly parent, sat beside her, moving only when necessary, as though the act of sitting still was a punishment she had chosen to endure. Behind them sat friends, neighbors, people from Sarah's workplace who had known her, who had respected her, who were struggling to comprehend how a woman they had known could be gone. They wore dark clothes, as though this were a funeral, and in many ways it was. The other half of the courtroom held the machinery of the law. The judge's bench, elevated and imposing, sat at the front. The jury box was empty for now. This was a preliminary hearing, not yet the full trial. The prosecution sat on one side of the aisle, files spread before them like a map of a case they already understood completely. The defense sat on the other side, their files more sparse, their argument not yet fully formed. And in the center, in a small area designated for the defendant, sat Marcus Webb, now formally charged with murder in the death of his mother. The judge's name was Patricia Chen, and she had entered the courtroom with the kind of authority that made everyone straighten in their seats. Judge Chen was 56 years old, and her face carried the kind of lines that came from years of listening to terrible stories, of watching people destroy each other, of making decisions that would affect lives forever. She had presided over hundreds of cases, and she had learned to read a courtroom the way a musician reads a score. She understood what the silence meant. She understood what the weight in the air represented. As she sat down and opened her legal file on the matter of the state versus Marcus Webb, she looked toward the defendant's table. Her eyes met Marcus's for just a moment, and something in that moment seemed to communicate something that Marcus did not yet understand. This woman had seen many people come before her. This woman would not be manipulated by youth or arrogance or the kind of smiles that convinced people to underestimate you. The prosecutor stood to begin her opening statement. She was a woman named Rachel Morrison, and she had prepared for this moment with meticulous care. "Your Honor," she began, "the state is prepared to demonstrate that the defendant, Marcus Webb, age 14, deliberately and with premeditation murdered his mother, Sarah Margaret Webb, age 38, who was at the time of her death 7 months pregnant. The evidence will show not only that the defendant committed this crime, but that he planned it, that he searched for information about how to commit it, that he announced his intention to commit it, and that he has shown no remorse whatsoever for having committed it. The state will also request that this court consider whether the defendant should be certified as an adult for purposes of trial and sentencing, given the severity of the crime and the evidence of planning and intent." The phrase adult certification hung in the air like a warning bell. It meant that if the judge agreed, Marcus could be tried as an adult. It meant that juvenile court protections could be stripped away. It meant that the sentences available to the judge would be far more severe. Marcus's public defender, a man named Robert Sullivan, stood to present the defense position. Sullivan was competent, but he was working against the tide of evidence that was already threatening to sweep his client away. "Your Honor," he said, "my client is 14 years old. He is a child. While we acknowledge that the state believes it has evidence connecting my client to this tragedy, we must remember that we are talking about a child. Children make poor decisions. Children lack impulse control. Children lack the fully developed prefrontal cortex necessary to understand the consequences of their actions. Whatever happened on November 12th, my client deserves to be treated as a juvenile, to be given the opportunity for rehabilitation, to be given a chance at a future. The law protects children for a reason. My client deserves that protection." It was a reasonable argument. It was, in many ways, the correct argument from a legal standpoint. But it was an argument that would collide almost immediately with the reality of what Marcus had done. As the hearing progressed, the prosecution began to present evidence. They played the 911 recording. The courtroom listened to Marcus's calm voice, reporting that his mother was unresponsive. They presented the text message. "It'll be quiet tonight." They presented the search history, dozens of searches about crime and evidence and the juvenile justice system. With each piece of evidence, the weight in the courtroom seemed to increase. The jury, which would not actually hear this evidence until trial, was not present, but the people in the gallery understood what they were hearing. They understood that this was not a case of a child making a tragic mistake. This was a case of a child who had planned something terrible and had executed that plan with precision. At one point during the presentation of the search history, Marcus became restless. He shifted in his seat. He whispered something to his lawyer, and then, apparently unable to contain himself, he interrupted the proceedings. "That's not fair," he said loudly, his voice cutting across the prosecutor's explanation. "You're twisting everything. I didn't do anything." Judge Chen's head turned slowly, her eyes fixed on Marcus with the kind of intensity that made people instinctively flinch. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority, "you will remain silent unless I ask you to speak. You will not interrupt these proceedings again. Do you understand me?" Marcus met her gaze for a moment, and then he shrugged. He literally shrugged, as though the judge's authority, like everything else in his world, could be dismissed with a simple gesture. A sound ran through the gallery, not quite audible, but present. It was the sound of people who understood what that shrug represented. It was the sound of people who understood that this boy believed he was beyond the reach of consequences. Judge Chen's jaw tightened slightly. She made a note in her file, and when she spoke again, her voice was even quieter, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Mr. Webb, I suggest you reconsider your attitude. You are in a courtroom. You are charged with a serious crime, and I will not tolerate disrespect to this court." Marcus said nothing, but he was still smiling that small, private smile. He was still convinced, it seemed, that all of this was somehow beneath him. The trial began 3 weeks later, on a Monday morning in February, when the sky was gray and the courtroom was filled with the kind of anticipatory silence that comes before a public execution of truth. The gallery was packed. Media outlets had been following the case since the arrest, and the story, 14-year-old kills pregnant mother, had captured something in the public imagination that demanded to be witnessed. Reporters sat in the seats reserved for press. Community members filled the remaining spots. People who knew Sarah Webb sat next to people who knew nothing about her, except that she had died. Everyone was there because they understood, on some fundamental level, that they were about to witness something that would test their assumptions about justice, about youth, about the capacity for evil that exists in human beings. The courtroom cameras were in place, allowed to film the proceedings under specific restrictions. This meant that everything that happened would be recorded, would be broadcast, would become part of the permanent record of what it meant to hold a young person accountable. Marcus entered the courtroom in his orange detention jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles because he had had an incident in custody. Nothing dramatic, but something that suggested he could not be fully trusted to behave. The prosecutor had argued for the shackles. The defense had argued against them, saying that the presence of restraints would bias the jury against the defendant. But Judge Chen had ruled that safety and security took precedence over appearance, and so Marcus was led into the courtroom in chains. What happened next would be captured on film and would eventually be played countless times on news broadcasts and in documentaries. As the bailiff led Marcus to the defense table, Marcus smiled. It was not a subtle smile this time. It was a full, deliberate grin directed at the gallery. For a moment, his eyes scanned the room, taking in the cameras, the reporters, the gathered crowd. And then he winked. He actually winked as though this were all somehow amusing to him, as though the gravity of what was happening was somehow less than he had imagined. The courtroom erupted in sound, gasps, murmurs of disbelief. Judge Chen's gavel came down hard, once, twice, 3 times, demanding silence. But the damage was done. The jury had seen what Marcus was. They had seen his arrogance, his lack of respect, his absolute certainty that none of this could actually touch him. The prosecution's case was presented methodically over the course of a week. Rachel Morrison, the prosecutor, had learned her craft over 20 years of criminal law, and she presented the evidence with the kind of precision that left no room for doubt. She began with the victim. She displayed photographs of Sarah Webb, smiling in a holiday photo, standing in the nursery with her hand on her pregnant belly, texting with friends. She presented Sarah not as an abstract concept, but as a person who had lived and had planned and had loved. Then she moved to the crime. She described the scene with clinical accuracy, but her words carried emotional weight. She described the violence that had been inflicted. She described the pregnancy that would never reach term. She described Eleanor, the baby girl who would never be born. And with each detail, she watched the jury's reaction. She watched them shift in their seats. She watched them exchange looks with one another. She watched them understand, with increasing certainty, that they were hearing about something monstrous. Throughout this presentation, Marcus sat at the defense table making faces. He rolled his eyes when testimony contradicted his story. He smirked when photographs of his mother were displayed. He whispered jokes to his lawyer that made the lawyer visibly uncomfortable and pull away slightly. At one point, when the medical examiner was describing Sarah's injuries, Marcus actually laughed. It was a quiet laugh, barely audible, but it was unmistakably there. Judge Chen saw it. The jury saw it. The gallery saw it. The camera recorded it. And in that moment, something shifted in the courtroom. The abstract question of guilt or innocence became irrelevant. What mattered now was whether this young person had any capacity for human feeling whatsoever. What mattered now was whether society needed to protect itself from him. The digital evidence was presented next. The forensic specialist described how she had recovered the deleted message from the cloud backup. She displayed it on a screen visible to the jury. "It'll be quiet tonight." She explained the timestamp, the phone number it had been sent from, the phone number it had been sent to. She described the search history with its queries about crime and evidence and the juvenile justice system. With each piece of digital evidence, she watched Marcus's expression change. The arrogance began to crack slightly, not because he seemed to feel genuine remorse, but because he seemed to be beginning to understand that his plan had not, in fact, been as perfect as he had believed. The evidence was overwhelming. The evidence was irrefutable. And the evidence suggested that a 14-year-old boy had done something that most people could not imagine doing. By the end of the first week, the jury was no longer looking at Marcus as a child who might have made a terrible mistake. They were looking at him as something else entirely, something harder, something more dangerous. The defense tried to argue that his youth meant something, that his brain was not fully developed, that he deserved rehabilitation rather than punishment. But those arguments seemed almost quaint in the face of the evidence. How do you rehabilitate someone who feels no remorse? How do you convince a jury that a child deserves a second chance when that child has shown no indication that he has learned anything from what he has done? As the week progressed, Marcus's demeanor began to change subtly. He still smiled, but the smiles came less frequently. He still whispered to his lawyer, but the whispers seemed more desperate. He was beginning, perhaps, to understand that his strategy of arrogance had been a miscalculation. He was beginning to understand that the courtroom and the jury and the judge were not going to respond the way he had expected them to respond. He was beginning to understand that age was not the armor he had believed it to be. The second week of trial was when the prosecution's case became not just compelling, but absolutely, mathematically airtight. The defense had spent the first week trying to create reasonable doubt, trying to suggest alternative explanations for the evidence, trying to keep alive the possibility that Marcus might have been falsely accused or that someone else might have been responsible. But reasonable doubt requires an alternative narrative, and the evidence presented in week 2 made alternative narratives impossible. The prosecutor called a digital forensics expert named Dr. Sandra Liu, who had spent 15 years recovering data from computers and phones, who had testified in hundreds of criminal trials, who understood the digital world the way most people understood the physical world. Dr. Liu presented the timeline with mathematical precision. She showed the jury the exact moment when the text message, "It'll be quiet tonight," had been sent from Marcus's phone. 6:47 p.m. She showed them the autopsy results, which placed the time of death between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. She explained that the message had been sent approximately 13 minutes before the window when the killing occurred. She explained that this timing could not be coincidence. She explained that this message, sent to another person, represented a communication about something Marcus intended to do in the immediate future. Then Dr. Liu presented the search history, but not the simple listing that had been shown before. She presented the searches in context with timestamps, showing the pattern of increasing specificity over a period of weeks. Early searches had been broad. How to commit a crime. What is murder? Can you go to jail for murder? Middle searches had become more focused. How much evidence is needed to convict someone? What is forensic evidence? Fingerprints. Late searches had become hyper-specific. How to clean up after a crime scene. How long does DNA evidence last? What happens if you are tried as a juvenile? The prosecutor asked Dr. Liu to explain what this pattern indicated. Dr. Liu, maintaining professional composure, explained that the pattern suggested someone systematically educating themselves about crime, evidence, and the legal consequences of committing a crime. She explained that this pattern suggested planning. She explained that this pattern suggested someone who was preparing to do something that they understood to be illegal and was trying to understand how to avoid the consequences of that illegal action. The jury was taking notes. The jury was leaning forward. The blood spatter expert came next. His name was Dr. Marcus Thornton, and he had spent 22 years analyzing crime scenes, understanding the physics of blood, teaching other investigators how to read what blood could tell them about violence. Dr. Thornton displayed photographs of the blood pattern on the walls and ceiling of Sarah Webb's bedroom. He explained, with careful precision, how blood moves through space based on force, velocity, and direction. He explained that the pattern he was seeing indicated repeated blows, delivered from a consistent angle and height. He explained that the height from which the blows were delivered was consistent with someone of Marcus Webb's stature. He displayed a photograph of Marcus standing next to a height chart, then displayed the blood spatter patterns beside it. The visual correlation was undeniable. The blood had been spattered by someone standing exactly where Marcus's height would place him. Dr. Thornton then explained the absence of defensive wounds, the absence of struggle indicators, the evidence that Sarah Webb had not fought back effectively. He explained what this indicated about the nature of the attack. It indicated someone who had acted with confidence, someone who had known what they were doing, someone who had not hesitated. The jury was no longer taking notes. The jury was simply staring at the evidence, understanding its implications. The forensic scientist who had analyzed Marcus's clothing came next. Her name was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, and she presented the blood evidence with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from absolute knowledge. She showed the jury photographs of blood on Marcus's shirt cuffs, blood that had been invisible to the naked eye, but visible under alternate light sources. She showed them the DNA analysis that proved the blood belonged to Sarah Webb. She explained the significance of finding blood on the cuffs, on the areas that would have been in contact with the victim during the application of force. She explained that this evidence placed Marcus in direct physical contact with his mother during the infliction of her injuries. There was no innocent explanation for blood on a murderer's cuffs. There was no alternative narrative that could account for it. She presented the analysis of Marcus's shoes, showing the forensic photographs of the shoe print in blood, comparing it to the tread pattern and wear marks on the shoe Marcus had been wearing. The match was clear. The match was undeniable. The match placed Marcus at the exact location where the violence had occurred. By the time Dr. Rodriguez finished her testimony, Marcus had stopped smiling. His expression had become something else, something harder, more resigned. He had begun to understand, perhaps, what everyone else in the courtroom already understood. The evidence was not just overwhelming, the evidence was complete. There was no gap that a defense argument could fit through. There was no ambiguity that could be exploited. There was simply the truth, presented methodically and scientifically, placed before the jury in a way that made denial impossible. The prosecutor had one more witness, a computer forensics specialist who explained that the messages Marcus had deleted could not actually be deleted. They existed in server backups, in cloud storage, in the digital memory of the cell phone company. They had been preserved, despite Marcus's best efforts to erase them. They had been recovered. They existed as evidence. The defense called a few witnesses of their own, but their testimony seemed almost desperate. They talked about Marcus's difficult childhood. They talked about his struggles in school. They talked about his age and his inability to fully understand consequences. But all of this testimony seemed small and insignificant in the face of the forensic evidence that had been presented. Judge Chen had been watching the jury throughout the entire second week. She had observed the moment when skepticism had transformed into certainty. She had observed the moment when the jury had begun to understand that their job was not really to determine guilt or innocence. The evidence had already done that, but rather to formally, solemnly, acknowledge what the evidence had revealed. On Friday afternoon, as the prosecution rested its case, Judge Chen leaned forward slightly in her chair. Her eyes moved from the evidence files to Marcus Webb, who sat at the defense table with his head down, his earlier arrogance now completely absent. She made a note in her file, and in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood that the judge had already made her own determination about what the evidence meant. Now they simply had to wait for the jury to catch up. The closing arguments began on Monday morning, and by this point the trial had taken on the feeling of a foregone conclusion. The prosecutor stood before the jury and did not need to be dramatic. She did not need to raise her voice or appeal to emotion. She simply needed to remind them of what they had already seen. The evidence, Rachel Morrison said, tells a story. It is a story written in text messages and search histories and blood patterns. It is a story that the defendant wrote himself, beginning weeks before the crime and continuing through the moment he called 911. Every piece of evidence confirms one simple truth. Marcus Webb planned to kill his mother. Marcus Webb prepared to kill his mother. And Marcus Webb killed his mother. And then he lied about it. She paused, letting that statement settle into the jury's consciousness. The defense wants you to believe that he is a child and therefore deserves leniency. But the evidence shows that he is a child who planned something that adults struggle to plan. The evidence shows that he is a child who understood consequences well enough to try to cover his tracks. The evidence shows that he is a child who has shown no remorse, no regret, and no indication that he has learned anything except that he was not as careful in covering his tracks as he believed he was. The defense's closing argument was brief and in many ways futile. Robert Sullivan did the best he could, emphasizing Marcus's age, the incomplete development of his brain, the possibility for rehabilitation. But his voice carried the weight of someone arguing against an impossible tide. He was asking the jury to see something in Marcus Webb that the evidence had systematically erased: humanity, capacity for change, some glimmer of the child he technically was. The jury looked at Marcus as Sullivan spoke, and their eyes were not unsympathetic exactly, but they were certain. They had seen the evidence. They had heard the testimony. They understood what they were being asked to do. They had to find this boy guilty of murdering his pregnant mother. There was no other conclusion that the evidence would support. When Sullivan finished, he sat down, and there was a moment of absolute silence in the courtroom before Judge Chen spoke. "The jury will now retire to consider its verdict," she said. "You will have the questions of law and fact to determine. You will base your verdict only on the evidence presented in this courtroom. You will not consider sympathy or emotion. You will consider only the facts and the law." The jury was out for 3 hours. 3 hours to do what everyone in the courtroom already knew they would do. 3 hours to formally, officially acknowledge what the evidence had already proved. When they returned, they filed into the jury box in silence. The jury foreperson, a woman named Margaret Hensley, who worked as a librarian and who had impressed everyone with her careful attention to detail, held the verdict forms. The bailiff asked her to stand. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Chen asked. "We have, Your Honor," Margaret Hensley said. The forms were passed to the judge, who read them silently, her expression unchanging. She handed them back to the bailiff, who read them aloud. "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Margaret Webb, the jury finds the defendant guilty." Margaret Hensley's voice was steady, but it seemed to carry the weight of everything that verdict meant. There was no second-guessing. There was no hesitation. It was guilty, clearly and unambiguously. For the first time in the trial, Marcus visibly reacted. His hand moved to his mouth. His eyes widened slightly. The certainty that had carried him through weeks of investigation and trial suddenly cracked. The verdict was read for the additional charges: guilty of the death of the unborn child, guilty of evidence tampering, guilty of obstruction of justice. 4 guilty verdicts, stacked one on top of another, each one a hammer blow to the invulnerability he had believed he possessed. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, and Marcus shrank away from it. He was shaking now, his body finally registering the weight of what had just been formally acknowledged. He had killed his mother. A jury of 12 citizens had determined, beyond any reasonable doubt, that he had deliberately taken her life. And now the next question would be, what should happen to him? Judge Chen called for a brief recess before the sentencing hearing would begin. But she announced, before the jury was excused, that she would be considering the prosecution's request for adult certification. "The severity of this crime," Judge Chen said, looking directly at Marcus, "and the evidence of premeditation and planning suggests that this court must consider whether the protections of juvenile court are appropriate in this case. The sentencing hearing will take place tomorrow morning. At that time, we will address not only the sentences themselves, but whether the defendant will be sentenced as a juvenile or as an adult." The words seemed to strike Marcus like a physical blow. He had believed from the beginning that his age would protect him, that juvenile court meant lighter sentences, that his age meant he might be out by his 20s, given a second chance, allowed to continue his life. But adult certification meant something entirely different. Adult certification meant that the sentences available to the judge would be dramatically longer. It meant that parole might not be possible for decades. It meant that the structure he had built his entire defense around, the assumption that being 14 years old meant automatic leniency, was about to be stripped away. That night, as Marcus sat in his cell in the detention facility, something changed inside him. For the first time since his arrest, he asked for something. He asked for the victim impact statements, which would be read the next day during sentencing. He wanted to know what was about to be said about him, about his mother, about the life he had destroyed. His lawyer brought him the statements, printed copies that would be read aloud in court. Marcus read them in the silence of his cell, and as he read, he began to cry. Not the kind of crying that comes from genuine remorse, perhaps, but the kind of crying that comes from the sudden, unavoidable understanding that your calculations have been wrong, that the world does not work the way you believed it to work, that age is not armor, that arrogance is not protection, that the law, like the forensic evidence, like the blood on his clothes, like the text message he thought he had deleted, remembers everything. The sentencing hearing began at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday in late February. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been during the trial, as though everyone who had been following the case wanted to be present for the final chapter of this story. The guilty verdict had been announced the day before, and overnight, Marcus Webb had transformed from a teenager who might face juvenile detention into a person who might spend decades in prison. The distinction was not subtle. It was the difference between possibility and finality. It was the difference between a life that might still be salvaged and a life that was being closed off. Sarah Webb's family sat in the gallery again, but something in their bearing had changed. Catherine, Sarah's sister, sat with her mother and with Sarah's best friend, Linda. They had the look of people who had been waiting for something, who were about to receive it, and who were not certain whether receiving it would actually help. Marcus entered the courtroom in chains again, but this time he was no longer smiling. This time he was no longer performing. He had spent the night before reading the victim impact statements, and something about that experience had broken through whatever wall had existed between him and the emotional reality of what he had done. He sat at the defense table with his eyes downcast, his shoulders hunched. He looked for the first time like what he was, a 14-year-old boy who had done something catastrophic and was about to face the consequences. His public defender sat beside him, and there was a quality of sadness in the lawyer's posture, as though he too understood that they were approaching the end of a story that could only end in one way. Judge Chen entered with the same authority she had carried throughout the trial. But today there was something else in her demeanor. Today she was not just a judge overseeing a trial. Today she was about to become the instrument through which justice would be delivered. The prosecutor stood first. She would present the state's position on sentencing, and she would present it through the voices of those whose lives had been destroyed. Linda, Sarah's best friend, read a statement about the woman she had known for 15 years. She spoke about Sarah's kindness, about her strength in rebuilding her life after difficult circumstances, about the pregnancy that she had been so excited about. She spoke about going to dinner and realizing that Sarah would never arrive at a restaurant again. She spoke about the baby girl, Eleanor, who would never exist. The statement was brief, but it was powerful because it did not rely on dramatic language. It simply told the truth about a loss that could not be repaired. Catherine read next, speaking about her sister as a sibling, about the relationship they had shared, about the niece or nephew who would never be born. She spoke about looking at the empty nursery and understanding, in a way that was almost physical, what had been taken from the world. Her voice broke only once, but that single break seemed to contain everything that could not be said, everything that was beyond words. The medical examiner presented the autopsy findings again, but this time the focus was not on cause of death, but on the reality of what had been inflicted. The prosecutor asked specific questions about the nature of Sarah's injuries, about how much pain she would have experienced, about whether she would have understood what was happening to her. The medical examiner answered with clinical precision, but his words carried weight that they had not carried during the trial. This was not about proving guilt. Guilt had already been established. This was about helping the court understand the magnitude of what had been taken. This was about the violence itself, stripped of all legal language, presented as simply what it was: a mother's body, damaged beyond repair, carrying a child who would never be born. The judge then asked if the defendant had anything he wished to say before sentencing. This was a formal requirement, a moment when the convicted person could address the court, could express remorse, could make a final statement before judgment was rendered. Marcus's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to him. For a long moment, Marcus did not respond. Then, slowly, he stood. His legs seemed unsteady. He had to grip the edge of the table to support himself. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I'm sorry," he said. The words seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, from a place that had been locked away during the entire trial. "I'm sorry for what I did." He paused, as though searching for more words, for some way to express something that seemed beyond expression. "I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know why I did it. I'm sorry." The statement was brief and, by any measure, inadequate. But it represented something that had not been present before, some acknowledgement of what he had done, some indication that he had finally, in some capacity, understood. Judge Chen listened without expression. When Marcus sat down, she made a note in her file. She looked at the victim's family, at the jury that had convicted him, at the evidence that surrounded this case, and then she looked directly at Marcus Webb. "Before I deliver the sentence of this court," she said, "I want to address some things that I believe need to be said. There will be an adult certification hearing. But before we address that question, I want to make clear what I am sentencing you for. You are sentenced for the deliberate taking of a human life, for the ending of a pregnancy, for planning, for deception, for the destruction of a family. And most importantly, you are sentenced for showing no genuine remorse until this morning, no recognition of the gravity of what you have done, no understanding of the consequences of your actions. Age is not an excuse for evil. Youth is not a defense against accountability." Judge Patricia Chen leaned back in her chair and let a moment of silence settle over the courtroom. It was the kind of silence that felt intentional, that felt designed to communicate something without words. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. "I have been on the bench for 28 years, she said. "I have sentenced murderers, violent offenders, people who have committed terrible crimes. I have learned through those years to recognize certain patterns. I have learned to recognize arrogance masquerading as youth. I have learned to recognize the difference between genuine remorse and performance designed to manipulate. I have learned to recognize when someone truly understands what they have done, and when someone is simply saying what they believe will help them escape consequences." She paused, and her eyes moved toward Marcus. "You, Mr. Webb, have demonstrated throughout this trial that you do not understand what you have done. You have smiled when photographs of your mother were displayed. You have laughed during testimony. You have shown contempt for this court, for the legal process, for the gravity of what you stand convicted of. It is only now, facing the prospect of an adult sentence, that you have expressed anything resembling remorse. That tells me something important about your character." Judge Chen opened a folder before her and began to read from the evidence that had been presented during trial. She recounted the timeline with precision. Sarah Webb had sent a text message at 5:43 p.m., planning to have dinner with her friend. At 6:47 p.m., Marcus Webb had sent a message announcing that "it'll be quiet tonight." Between 7 p.m. and 8:00 p.m., he had killed her. He had then spent approximately 20 minutes in the house before calling 911. The judge explained each piece of evidence, not in the technical terms used by the forensic specialists, but in moral language. She described the blood evidence as evidence of violence, of force, of pain. She described the search history as evidence of planning, of intent, of a 14-year-old who had educated himself on how to commit a crime and avoid detection. She described the deleted message not as digital forensics, but as evidence of conspiracy with himself, an announcement to another person of what he intended to do. As she spoke, the courtroom remained absolutely silent. "The defense has argued," Judge Chen continued, "that you are a child, that your brain is not fully developed, that you deserve rehabilitation rather than punishment. There is science to support some of these claims. It is true that adolescent brains are still developing. It is true that children sometimes lack impulse control. But that argument assumes that this crime was an impulse. That argument assumes that you acted without thinking, without planning, without understanding what you were about to do. The evidence proves otherwise. The evidence shows calculation. The evidence shows planning. The evidence shows that you understood at some level that what you were about to do was wrong, and that you took steps to avoid the consequences of that wrong action. A young person who acts on impulse does not search the internet for how to clean up crime scenes. A young person who acts without thinking does not delete text messages and attempt to hide evidence. A young person who lacks understanding does not lie to police with such consistency and such apparent comfort. Judge Chen paused and drank from a glass of water. The act was simple, but it commanded the courtroom's attention. When she resumed, her voice carried the weight of finality. You took your mother's life. You also took your sister's life, the child she was carrying, who would have been born in 2 months. You destroyed a family. You devastated a community. And more than that, you revealed something about yourself that is deeply concerning. You revealed an absence of empathy, an absence of remorse, and an absence of the capacity to understand other people's suffering as real or significant. Those characteristics, narcissism, callousness, lack of genuine emotion, are not things that typically change through rehabilitation programs. They are not things that typically respond to therapy. They are structural elements of personality that are extremely difficult to alter. She looked directly at Marcus. I am not convinced that rehabilitation is possible in your case. I am not convinced that age gives you a pass from accountability for what you have done. The prosecutor had requested that adult certification be granted. The defense had argued against it, suggesting that Marcus should remain in the juvenile system, where sentences are capped and rehabilitation is emphasized. But Judge Chen was now walking through the factors that the law required her to consider when making this determination. The severity of the offense, first-degree murder, was as severe as crimes came. The evidence of premeditation, the search history, the text message, the planning all pointed to premeditation. The sophistication of the crime. While not perfectly executed, the crime had shown a level of planning and control that was unusual for someone of Marcus's age. The maturity of the defendant. The judge noted that Marcus had shown throughout the trial a level of arrogance and contempt that suggested significant maturity in certain respects. Maturity directed toward manipulation and evasion of responsibility. The judge was building methodically and carefully a case for certifying Marcus as an adult. I am certifying you as an adult for the purposes of trial and sentencing, Judge Chen said. You will be tried and sentenced as an adult would be tried and sentenced. The protections of the juvenile justice system, which exist for children who make mistakes and deserve the possibility of rehabilitation, will not apply to you. Those protections are designed for children who can still learn, still grow, still become functional members of society. The evidence in this case suggests that you do not fall into that category. Marcus had been crying quietly throughout the judge's statements, but at these words, something in his expression changed. He had understood, intellectually, that adult certification was a possibility. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the judge formally announce that he would be treated as an adult, seemed to make it real in a way that had not been real before. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard that his knuckles turned white. Judge Chen then addressed the question of sentencing. I am aware that you are 14 years old, she said. I am aware that even with adult certification, there are certain constraints on the sentences I can impose. However, the crimes you have committed are among the most serious that come before this court. I am sentencing you to 25 years to life, with a minimum of 25 years before you are eligible for parole consideration. This sentence reflects the severity of your crimes, the evidence of premeditation, the absence of remorse until this moment, and the danger that you represent to society. You will not be released from prison until you are at least 39 years old, and at that point it will be up to a parole board to determine whether you have shown genuine change and growth. I suspect they will not. She paused, and her gaze remained on Marcus for a long moment. You entered this courtroom believing that your age would protect you. You believed that the system would see a child deserving of leniency. You believed that you were clever enough to evade consequences. You were wrong. The evidence found you. The jury convicted you, and now this court has sentenced you. You will have the rest of your life to contemplate what your arrogance has cost you. The gavel came down once, and the sound echoed through the courtroom like a punctuation mark on a story that could no longer be changed. Judge Chen had finished her pronouncement. The sentence had been delivered. 25 years to life. Minimum of 25 years. Marcus Webb would not be released from prison until he was at least 39 years old, and even then, it would not be guaranteed. It would require a parole board to review his case, to assess whether he had shown genuine remorse and rehabilitation, to determine whether he was safe enough to be released back into society. Given the evidence of his character, given the absolute lack of genuine remorse he had displayed until this morning, given the cold calculation that had underlain his crime, the probability that he would ever be released seemed vanishingly small. 25 years. More than half his lifetime already lived. The next third of his life, and possibly more, would be spent behind bars. The implications of that sentence began to settle into the silence that followed the gavel strike. Catherine Webb, Sarah's sister, made a sound that was somewhere between a cry and a gasp. It was not a sound of joy, exactly. It was not a sound of satisfaction. It was the sound of someone who had been waiting for something to end, and who had finally been given confirmation that the waiting was over. Her mother reached over and took her hand. They sat together, still grieving, still shattered by loss, but at least no longer suspended in the uncertainty of what would happen next. The sentence would not bring Sarah back. The sentence would not restore the life that had been taken. The sentence would not allow Eleanor to be born, to grow, to live the life she might have lived. But the sentence represented something. It represented the world's acknowledgement that what Marcus had done was wrong. It represented the world's refusal to treat his youth as an excuse for evil. It represented accountability, finally and formally, in a way that could not be appealed or negotiated or escaped through manipulation. The defense attorney, Robert Sullivan, had a devastated expression. He had done his job, done it competently and professionally, but the job had always been an impossible one. How do you defend someone who is obviously guilty, who has shown contempt for the court, and whose crimes are among the most serious that come before a judge? Sullivan had tried to frame Marcus as a child deserving of rehabilitation, but the evidence and Marcus's own behavior had made that argument unsustainable. Now, as the judge delivered the sentence, Sullivan could only sit beside his client and watch as years were added, one on top of another. 25 years. It was a sentence that would essentially define Marcus Webb for the rest of his natural life. It was a sentence that meant childhood was over. It was a sentence that meant the future he had once imagined for himself, college, career, relationships, the normal progression of a life, would never happen in the way he had envisioned it. The prosecutor, Rachel Morrison, remained sitting at her table, her expression neutral. She had presented her case. She had presented the evidence. She had presented the victim impact statements. She had done what the state had asked her to do, which was to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves, to represent the interests of a victim who would never speak in a courtroom again, to seek justice on behalf of a community that had been violated by this crime. The sentence was not hers to give or take, but she understood, as did everyone in that courtroom, that the sentence represented the culmination of everything she had worked toward. It represented the law's answer to the crime. It represented, as much as the law could represent anything, justice. Not perfect justice, no sentence could repair what had been taken, but justice nonetheless. Marcus was visibly trembling now. His face had gone pale. The reality of what had just been pronounced seemed to be settling on him with physical weight. 25 years. He was 14 years old. When he was released, if he was released, he would be 39. He would have spent the bulk of his youth and his early adulthood in prison. He would have missed the experiences that defined most people's lives: education, friendship, romance, the simple experience of moving through the world freely. He would have spent decades in a cell, eating prison food, following prison rules, existing in an environment designed to punish and contain. And beyond that, beyond those 25 years, there was the question of parole. The judge had made clear that she had little confidence in his capacity for rehabilitation. She had made clear that she believed his crimes revealed something about his character that was difficult, perhaps impossible, to change. What parole board would look at that judicial assessment and think, yes, this person has shown genuine change and should be released? The sentence was, in effect, a life sentence, just one that technically had a possibility of release attached to it. The courtroom erupted in activity after the sentence was pronounced. The bailiff moved toward Marcus to return him to custody. The media, having been held in check throughout the trial, began to move toward the exits, already composing the headlines that would announce the sentence to the world. The family members in the gallery began to stand, to collect their things, to process what had just happened. A 14-year-old boy had been sentenced to spend his most productive years, his most formative years, in prison. A family had lost a mother and a sister. A community had witnessed the consequences of one young person's arrogance and evil. And the legal system had done what it was supposed to do, which was to hold him accountable, to protect society from him, and to make clear that age was not a shield against responsibility. As Marcus was led from the courtroom in chains, his earlier confidence and arrogance had been completely stripped away. What remained was a teenager confronting the reality of what his actions had cost him. His face was wet with tears. His body was shaking. He was no longer smiling. The smirk that had defined his appearance throughout the trial was gone, replaced by an expression of despair and shock. He had believed for so long that he was clever enough to escape consequences. He had believed that his age would protect him. He had believed that the world would bend to his will, that he could manipulate circumstances, that he could kill his mother and walk away. But the world had not bent. The system had not bent. The judge had looked directly at his arrogance and had responded with a sentence that would define the rest of his life. As he was removed from the courtroom and led toward the holding cell that would take him back to detention, the full weight of his miscalculation had finally, completely settled on him. 3 months after the sentencing, Marcus Webb arrived at Northridge Correctional Facility on a gray morning that felt appropriate for the occasion. The facility was a maximum security prison designed to house the state's most dangerous offenders, and Marcus, despite his youth, had been classified as a significant security risk. The intake process was routine and dehumanizing in the way that prison intake is designed to be. His clothes were removed. His body was searched. He was photographed for the institutional record. He was assigned a number that would, for the next 25 years minimum, be his primary identifier. He was given a uniform and placed in a cell in the Young Offenders Unit, a section of the prison reserved for inmates under 21 years old. The smirk was gone. The arrogance was gone. What remained was a teenager adjusting to the reality of having destroyed his own future through his own choices. The prison psychologist who evaluated Marcus during his first weeks of incarceration noted that he displayed signs of depression and what might be accurately characterized as shock. He had, it seemed, finally understood what 25 years meant. He had finally comprehended that his youth would be spent in a cell, that his formative years would be defined by prison rules and prison violence, that the world he had known was now completely inaccessible to him. The psychologist noted that while Marcus continued to deny full responsibility for his actions, he blamed his mother for being difficult, blamed the system for not understanding him, blamed circumstance for his situation, there was at least some indication that he was beginning to process the magnitude of his sentence. Whether that processing would eventually lead to genuine remorse or simply to a deeper resentment remained to be seen. Meanwhile, Sarah Webb's community continued to process their own loss. The house on Oakwood Heights was sold. The new owners, knowing nothing of what had happened there, would paint over the history. They would finish the nursery that Sarah had begun. They would give that room to their own children. The crib that Sarah had purchased remained in storage with her sister, who could not yet bear to dispose of it. The photograph of Sarah with her hand on her pregnant belly remained on Catherine's bedside table. The baby girl, who would have been named Eleanor, remained a presence in the family's consciousness, not a person who had lived, but a person who might have lived, a life that should have existed, but never would. Sarah's friends had created a scholarship in her name, given to students studying to become nurses or medical professionals. It was a small way of transforming her loss into something that might help others. It was the kind of memorial that Sarah, who had spent her life helping people, might have appreciated. Judge Patricia Chen had received numerous letters in the weeks after the sentencing, letters from people who had followed the trial. Letters from people who appreciated her clear-eyed assessment of what the evidence meant and what it said about the defendant. Letters from people who believed that she had made the right decision in certifying Marcus as an adult and in imposing the sentence she had imposed. She had also received angry letters from people who believed that she had been too harsh, that a 14-year-old deserved more compassion, that rehabilitation should have been prioritized over punishment. Judge Chen read all of the letters with the same careful attention she had given to the trial itself. She understood that there were two ways of looking at her decision, as harsh and unforgiving, or as just and necessary. She believed her decision had been the latter, and she was at peace with that belief. The courtroom where the trial had taken place returned to its ordinary function. Other cases were tried there. Other judges made decisions that would change other lives. But everyone who had been present during the Marcus Webb trial understood that they had witnessed something significant. They had watched a young person's arrogance collide with evidence, and they had watched arrogance lose. They had watched the legal system work, methodically and carefully, to determine truth and impose accountability. They had watched a mother's life be honored through testimony and evidence. They had watched a community's need for justice be satisfied, at least to the extent that justice could be satisfied. And they had watched a young person understand, finally and completely, that the world did not work the way he had believed it worked. In his cell in Northridge Correctional Facility, Marcus Webb would spend his days, his months, his years. He would age, he would grow. Whether he would genuinely change remained an open question. The psychological assessments suggested that true remorse might not be possible for someone with his personality structure. But the law did not require remorse. The law required only that he be held accountable, and that accountability was being enforced one day at a time in the form of a prison sentence that would extend far into his future. The smirk was gone. The contempt was gone. What remained was simply time. 25 years of time to contemplate the consequences of his arrogance. Sarah Webb's sister stood in front of her sister's photograph one evening and thought about the judgment that had been delivered. She thought about Marcus Webb sitting in his cell, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that his youth had not protected him. She thought about Eleanor, who would never be born. She thought about her sister, who had been rebuilding her life, who had been hopeful about the future, who had been cheated of the chance to see that future unfold. The sentence was not perfect. No sentence could be. But it was what the law could offer: accountability, consequence, the formal acknowledgement that what had been taken could not be repaired, but that the person who had taken it would be held responsible. She placed her hand on the photograph and whispered a word that she had spoken many times since Sarah's death. Justice, she whispered. Not complete, not perfect, but real. He thought his age would protect him. He believed his intelligence would outsmart the system. He was certain his arrogance was invisible to everyone around him. He was wrong. The evidence found him. The jury convicted him. The judge condemned him. And now, as the years stretch out before him like a prison yard with no exit, he finally understands what he should have understood all along, that the world, despite what he believed, was not made for him alone. That justice, though slow, is relentless. That some decisions cannot be undone. That the smirk fades when you understand, truly and completely, what you have done. 14 years old. That's how old he was when he walked into that courtroom wearing a smirk that would haunt everyone in that room for years to come. He sat there, shackled at the wrists, and laughed. While the prosecutor read the words murder and pregnant, he leaned back in his chair like he was watching a comedy. His mother would never see her daughter born. Her unborn baby would never take a breath. And he knew something the judge didn't know yet, or at least he thought he did. He believed his age would protect him, that the law would see a child instead of what he truly was. But there was a voice coming that day. Not the judges, not the prosecutors. A voice that would strip away every excuse, every lie, every last thread of arrogance he clung to. Stories like this remind us that justice doesn't always move quickly, but it always arrives. If you believe in accountability, in a system that protects the innocent and holds the guilty responsible, hit subscribe now. And below, tell us what you think. Would you believe him if you didn't see the evidence? This is how it all began. Her name was Sarah. She was 38 years old, and she was 7 months pregnant. The nursery in her house was half finished, pale yellow walls, a crib still in pieces on the floor, folded baby clothes stacked neatly in a plastic bin. She'd been rebuilding her life, piece by piece, after years of difficulty. And for the first time in a long time, she was happy. She had her son. She had her new baby on the way. She had a small house in a quiet neighborhood where nothing bad was supposed to happen, where people knew each other's names and looked out for one another. The porch light was always on, the doors locked at night. Everything was normal, everything was safe, or at least that's what she believed. That 14-year-old boy with the smirk had been in that house on the night of November 12th. The police knew it. The prosecutor knew it. The gallery watching from the wooden benches knew it. But he didn't seem to understand yet that knowing and proving were no longer the same thing. His name was Marcus Webb, and he sat at the defense table wearing an Orange County detention jumpsuit, his wrists cuffed to a steel chain around his waist. He was small for his age, just under 5 feet, with the shoulders of a child and hands that looked too young to hold the weight of what they'd done. But his eyes were different. His eyes belonged to someone else entirely. When the judge entered the courtroom on that gray morning in January, everyone stood. Everyone except Marcus, who shifted lazily in his seat and whispered something to his public defender that made his lips curl into that smile, that terrible, empty smile. The prosecutor began to speak. Her voice was steady, measured, professional. She had done this before. She had stood in front of judges and juries and told them about violence and loss, and she had learned to control her breathing, to keep her emotion locked behind a wall of facts. "Your Honor," she said, "on the night of November 12th, the defendant unlawfully and willfully took the life of his mother, Sarah Margaret Webb, age 38. At the time of her death, the victim was 7 months pregnant with her second child. The defendant's actions resulted in not one death, but 2. Marcus's smile didn't waver. He didn't blink. He didn't shift his gaze to the gallery where his mother's sister sat rigid in the 3rd row, her hands trembling in her lap. The prosecutor continued, laying out the charges. First-degree murder, attempted murder of an unborn child, destruction of evidence, obstruction of justice. Words that should have meant something to a 14-year-old. Words that should have landed like stones in a still pond. Instead, he yawned. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the evidence was already in the courtroom. It was in the files stacked in front of the prosecution, in the testimony waiting to be given, in the digital footprints he thought he'd erased but couldn't have. There was a phone with a deleted text message that forensics had recovered from a cloud backup. The message had been sent at 6:47 p.m. on November 12th just 2 hours before Sarah Webb's neighbors heard nothing at all. The message was simple. 4 words. "It'll be quiet tonight." Marcus had deleted it from his phone almost immediately. He'd thought that meant it was gone. He'd thought deletion meant erasure. He'd thought he understood how technology worked well enough to cover his tracks. But technology remembers everything, and forensic specialists are trained to listen to what machines have to say. The prosecutor knew about the message, the judge would know about the message, and by the time the trial ended, everyone in that courtroom would know that Marcus Webb had planned this moment. The judge was watching him carefully. She was a woman named Patricia Chen, 56 years old, with 28 years on the bench and a reputation for severity that made defense attorneys nervous. She had sentenced murderers, embezzlers, and violent offenders, and she had learned to read faces the way a sailor reads the ocean. She understood what arrogance looked like. She understood what denial looked like. She understood what a child looked like when he had done something unspeakable and couldn't yet accept that the world would not bend to protect him. Judge Chen wrote something on her legal pad, and Marcus didn't seem to notice that the pen moved not in agreement, but in judgment. He was too busy smiling at his lawyer, too busy making a gesture with his cuffed hands that suggested nothing here could touch him. He was too young to understand that the most dangerous thing in that courtroom wasn't the prosecutor, or the evidence, or even the judge. The most dangerous thing was